Today we're talking about a little bit of a controversial topic, and that would be the topic of cutting ball python eggs, or really cutting any reptile eggs before they hatch. Specifically, we're going to be talking about what possible pros and cons there can be to doing such a thing, and furthermore, how to do it properly. A lot of people do egg cutting videos, yours truly as well. So I'd say the vast majority of people do, at least in some way, support cutting eggs. And I do say that in that fashion because there's multiple ways people justify cutting an egg, and not all ways are created equal. Before we get into the pros and cons, let's discuss how to cut a ball python egg. And the first things that I want to do is, obviously you want to take great care while holding these animals. You should treat them like a baby because, well, they are literally a baby. So you want to keep them safe and secure. I typically place down a towel and put the egg on it. Obviously there's going to be a little goop that is going to be involved in these. It is certainly not a clean process. And it's also going to be a little bit bloody. However, it is not the blood of the snake unless you have done something horribly wrong. The first things I do is I pinch the egg and I kind of roll my fingers back and forth. The reason for this is to move the veins that are naturally on the top of the egg out of the way so that it can prevent, well, a lot of leakage, so to speak. And sometimes you're going to get that regardless. But that doesn't harm anything necessarily, but it does bleed into the egg itself. And if there's a bunch of blood in the way, well, that's going to obscure your view. You're also going to make sure that the snake is not pushing up against anything. The snake might actually already be out of its embryonic sac, and it might be pushing up against the top of the egg, in which case you certainly don't want to cut the animal. So you're going to want to do this pinching tactic, in my opinion. This ensures that you cut just the slit in the egg and not the snake itself, which obviously is very important. You want to take great care that you don't do too much of a cut. Take a peek and you're making sure that nothing is wrong. Obviously, if there is something wrong, sometimes you might have to intervene, in which case you might have to do something that normally you would never ever have to or want to do, and that would be further mess with the animal before they've even come out of the egg. This is a absolute last resort, so it should not be something that you regularly do. And then once you've basically secured an exit for your snake for when they finally do come out, you want to leave them alone. Put them back in the incubator after you're done and leave them be. Continual checking on the animal is how egg cutting can sometimes go wrong as well. So let's talk about the pros of egg cutting. And the number one reason that it could possibly be beneficial is for you to help free a snake that could not cut its way out of the egg. Sometimes, and it is not very common, a snake is, for whatever reason, unable to cut its way out of the egg. Perhaps it was born without an egg tooth. An egg tooth is something that's on a baby ball python that has not hatched yet, and this tooth serves literally one purpose and then falls off, and it's to cut their way out of the egg. Without this egg tooth, it would be very difficult to get out of the egg, if not impossible. And once they break out of the sac that they're in, they are in an egg, but they're also in a sac in the egg. They are no longer receiving the benefits of being in the egg. And the egg's benefits were the veins on top, which gathered oxygen from the air and gave it to the body of the snake. Once it breaks the sac that it's in, it's now needing air, which reptiles don't need as much air, especially snakes, as we do. So they can survive underwater for quite a bit of time, but they're gonna need air, and they're not gonna get it in the egg. So if they lost that egg tooth, you would see that a couple did not hatch on their own, and you'd cut in there and you'd find the snake dead, and on the top of the eggshell you'd find a bunch of little scratches, but nothing that got through. That to me is terrifying. So that is definitely one reason to cut into the egg, even if you weren't going to look. Another big reason would be to look for certain issues. Now, there's certain issues you can do nothing about. If the snake is born deformed in a very massive way, sometimes they can live with these deformities, but sometimes they cannot. Those deformities we'll get back to later. But what the issues I'm talking about are a wrapped umbilical cord. I have saved at least 2 snakes since I've started this from wrapped umbilical cords. So the snake egg and the snake had not been messed with in any way up until this moment. It was already wrapped in its umbilical cord. And a wrapped cord is probably the number one cause of ball python, at least, passing away that would normally be healthy. When this happens, you are going to have to intervene and remove the wrapped umbilical cord. And what that means is it's wrapped around the body of the snake in some fashion. If you can see it, a little pink ring going around the body of the snake in any way, shape, or form, then it is wrapped. Now, you have a couple things working in your favor, and that's that the snake is already incredibly lubricated. Slipping the ring off of the snake is not difficult in my opinion. I've done it now with relative ease. Usually you just find which end of the snake, which is, I found the tail almost every single time because of where the umbilical cord is located. You'll want to work it very slowly and gently, pulling the snake's body up towards you you're preferably attempting to keep it in the egg during this time, you might need to remove the tail part of the snake and then slipping it off. And once you've done this, you leave it be. There's a chance at this point that the umbilical cord has become damaged, and at this point would probably just fall off on its own. It might not absorb all of its yolk, which isn't ideal, but I've never had an issue with this myself. I think that in the worst case scenario, you might have to move in with feeding a little quicker and maybe even assist feeding if the snake is not eating and it did not absorb all its yolk. But naturally, I think that it's best to try to let the snake eat on its own, which I think typically will be the case. But in some cases, if they do not, or if the yolk itself has gone very, very bad, that's maybe a topic for another time, but you might have to tie off the umbilical cord and then cut below that tie. It's as simple as that. You take usually dental floss, you tie the umbilical cord, and then you cut obviously below that, being on the side of the knot that's furthest from the snake. If you cut obviously closer to the snake, then what was the point of making the knot? Another pro, which is more of a fun pro than anything beneficial to the snake at all, and that's that you're opening your present a little early. Not much to really say here other than the fact that it is the most exciting part of it. Obviously, the reasoning that people use to justify cutting the eggs is that it's to look for issues and to create that opening for the snake. But what they want is to see what they got early. So what are the cons to opening a snake egg? Well, first of all, good luck IDing exactly what you've got. If you've watched any of my egg cutting videos, I spitball and guess, and usually I'm mostly right, but never am I 100% right. It's really impossible in some cases, unless it's an extreme color morph, to determine 100% with absolute accuracy what you got. And if you're looking at it from my standpoint of opening them to see what you got, well, it's really kind of pointless. I mean, you're gonna get what you get, right? But again, that should not be the primary reason that people should be cutting anyways. The other con would be that you open them too early. And well, this con is easily avoidable. Don't. One of the best ways to determine that is wait till the first egg pips. They all incubated together in the same exact environment, so long as you did not split the clutch for whatever reason. So they should all be hatching at exactly the same time. So the first time that one comes out, you know that they are essentially all ready. This is probably the best way to do it. A snake egg takes roughly 60 days to hatch, give or take a bit, because of temperatures. And the lower the temperature, the slower the egg is to hatch. And the higher the temperature, the higher it is to hatch. Now, obviously that's not a perfect science, because if it gets really low, the egg will just die. And if it's too hot, well, then you have an omelet. So there is a range, and from my understanding, 87 is the absolute lowest, which I've never done. I started my first year at 88, and then I moved it up to the probably normal average that most people use at 89. I've heard of people incubating up to 91 as well, and that they get their eggs a little faster. But I wouldn't go any more than this. Although I know people can and have, and it's probably safe, but I would not risk heating them anymore. It's probably safer to do them even lower. In fact, I've heard more success stories of people hatching ball python eggs at 85 degrees, and that it takes a considerable amount more time, but they hatch. Just a good rule of thumb there. But believe it or not, if you cut your egg too early, it's actually probably fine. There are plenty of stories of people accidentally cutting them a week into incubation, or tearing the egg when they're trying to put away the eggs, because these eggs stick together quite a bit. In fact, we have tape nearby just in case this happens, and I don't know of anybody who actually tore open an egg and lost the egg, so long as they were able to tape it before much of the fluid got out. If you tape the egg shut and prevent it from leaking out that fluid, it's going to hatch almost every single time. They are very durable creatures, and that includes before they're born. And the number one con of cutting a ball python egg would be that you're actually going to accidentally create an issue. And that kind of piggybacks off of opening too early, because that could create an issue. If you open a ball python's egg before it was ready to hatch, and that ball python breaks out of its amniotic sac a little too early, it can move around in there before it's fully developed its egg, and they can sometimes tie themselves up. To prevent this con, it's as simple as this. As soon as you've cut them, stop messing with them. You now see whatever you're going to see. You're also checking for issues. You don't want to create one, so as soon as you do that, cover them back up as best as you can and leave them be. Over checking on an animal because you are excited is probably the number one way that you could muck this up. That snake is alive, and it is going to respond to you, and the first thing it sees is a giant looking at it through all this stuff, disturbing it, moving it around, so that means that they can twist themselves up, and the more you interact with them, the more they are going to move around in there, which means the higher chance that they create that issue and tie themselves up. And what did I say earlier? It is the number one way that a otherwise healthy snake will die, is by wrapping the umbilical cord around itself and essentially starving itself of air and nutrients. Another con would be cutting the egg to look for an issue and finding an issue that's, well, far too gone to fix. Kinked snakes that are so kinked they couldn't possibly digest food. If you cut that egg, well, it's going to come out of the egg now and it's going to live. So therefore at that point, it's going to starve to death if you do nothing, which means you'd have to call the animal. And that's a fancy word for ethically kill. Sadly, one of the better ways to do it would be to eliminate the brain. And when I mean eliminate the brain, I don't mean cut the head off. I mean, well, you can put two and two together. It's grisly and it's wretchedly horrible, but it is what it is. There's other methods too. CO2, which would basically be starving the animal of oxygen and suffocating it. I don't think I'd recommend this. I've heard some mixed things about how, since ball pythons and reptiles in general do not breathe as quick as we do, that this could be a little cruel. I also highly do not recommend freezing. I still hear people do this to this day, and from everything I've heard is that the animal can definitely feel itself starting to freeze to death. The best way, honestly, is to get a snake-eating snake, and I'm not talking about a cobra, I'm talking about a harmless California king snake or something along those lines. Something that's big enough to eat a baby ball python hatching and that will do it. So buy yourself a retired breeder that's mean and will eat anything and that you'd never want to touch because it's a jerk, because it will just eat those and it'll do the job for you that you don't want to do, because trust me, it's terrible. There are some that would tell you that it's not good to cut at all for any reason. You should leave them alone forever. And that means that if it reaches day 70 and they start to mold and rot, that was now natural selection. They say that this is the way that it is in the wild, so therefore it should be that way here. But I, quite frankly, will call poppycock to that. That is nonsense. They are not in the wild. You have chosen to breed these animals in a selective breeding process. This is not the natural animal kingdom that we are discussing anymore. You have removed that completely from the situation. They are not animals that you could release back into the wild and expect them to do very well. So therefore, in my opinion, it is kind of cruel to not step in and attempt to save this animal in certain cases. So please consider that. It is not a natural process that you have done. You have introduced these animals in a controlled environment and you are now seeing it through to the end. It is, in my opinion, your responsibility to care for them. So yes, personally, I am pro cutting egg, because in the end, I think that the pros outweigh the cons, especially if you do it right. And if it's not really for you, but you'd still like the benefits of it, then just do the quick cut. And I'm talking like that big of a cut. It's enough to get the snake's head out. But with that said, you've already made the cut. So you might as well indulge that curious cat and take a peek. It's incredibly fun to open your presents a little bit early, but you should be aware of the pros and cons. And just because I'm here telling you that I believe in it, this might blow your mind, but that doesn't mean it has to be okay for you. It's okay to have contrasting viewpoints on this. Mind-blowing, right? I just think that the pros outweigh the cons, and I won't stop doing it because I've saved snake lives, and that's the main reason why I can justify doing it. As much as I want to get the sneak peek, I would not do it if I did not think that that was the case, if I did not only think, if I did not know that that was the case. But just remember, you have taken nature out of this. That is not up for debate. You have now intervened and created a selective breeding program. So you do owe it to your animals to give them the best possible chance at life. So I hope you enjoyed the video. If you like this video, you can actually check out a few of our other educational videos right here.